Our next speaker is talking about all-purpose foods and the shift to plant-based diets. Where do plant protein foods fit? It's Julie Hess from the USDA.
Sorry, 1 second.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to present. Also, thank you to my fellow presenter. I could not have set this talk up better myself. So thank you for going over so much of the background information. So like Chris said, my name is Julie Hess. I'm a researcher with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I'm based at the Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center. So all of the research that I'll be presenting today that's from my group is publicly funded research. It's all supported by the USDA. I am a former employee of the National Dairy Council. And for full transparency, my personal diet includes ultra-processed foods and unprocessed foods, as well as foods of plant and animal origin. You all know where I'm coming from now. So my fellow presenter set this up quite nicely, but I'll go over a tiny bit of the context myself. So the concept of ultra-processed foods was first introduced in 2009 by Dr. Montero, and he really saw this as a way to move away from how he perceived the change in nutrition science as becoming more of a reductionist focus. We're looking at foods, we're looking at beverages, we're looking at individual nutrients, and in the process of looking so narrowly at these components, we're kind of missing the forest for the trees. And so he saw this framework for ultra-processed foods and this term of ultra-processed foods as a way to move back towards looking at overall dietary patterns and also seeing what had happened to foods in the change from focusing more on overall diets to focusing more on these specific components of diets. So he, of course, came up with the NOVA categorization system, and we've already gone over this today, so I won't spend any more time on it. I do want to go briefly over the observational research on ultra-processed foods. I'm sure you all have seen a lot of the research that's has come out about them, and we went over some of them in the previous presentation. But the current body of research is primarily observational, and it largely indicates negative health outcomes associated with more calories coming from ultra-processed foods. So there have been a number of studies published since 2009, and they show that increased intake of ultra-processed foods has been associated with lower micronutrient intake, with an increased risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes, higher added sugar intake, lower fiber intake. Pretty much, if you can think of an adverse health outcome, there's probably been an observational study that shows an association between eating more calories from ultra-processed foods and that health outcome. But like we heard already, there's really only been one randomized control trial that actually fed people a diet containing mostly ultra-processed food or a diet containing mostly unprocessed foods, again, as defined by the NOVA scale in humans. And this was Dr. Hall's study at the NIH, and he matched these diets for energy, energy density, fat, sodium, fiber, and macronutrients between this ultra-processed and unprocessed diet. And he found results similar to what we've seen in the observational research so far. The energy intake and weight gain were higher on the ultra-processed foods diet than when the participants were consuming the unprocessed foods diet. But as carefully as the study was done, one of the major limitations of this study was actually the diets themselves. So if you look at, for example, if you pull up the supplementary files of this study, you can see what was actually fed to participants when they were consuming the ultra-processed diet versus when they were consuming the unprocessed diet. So I have up here the day 6 lunch menu, and you'll see when participants were consuming the ultra-processed menu for day 6, they had cheeseburgers and fries and diet lemonade with added fiber. And when they were consuming the unprocessed lunch on day 6, they had salmon and green beans and mashed sweet potatoes and yogurt and strawberries. So I would expect, even just if I were to sit down to one of these lunches, that I would feel differently after consuming salmon and green beans versus cheeseburgers and french fries. And in case you think I'm cherry picking this data, I wanted to show the day 3 lunch menu as well. So we have this beautiful green salad with roasted chicken and farro and a homemade vinaigrette for the unprocessed menu. And then for the ultra-processed menu, we have chicken nuggets, baked lays, and again, diet lemonade with fiber added. So the only similarity between this day 3 lunch menu is that they both contain chicken. So again, like I said, this was published in 2019. We're going to fast forward a little bit to today. Ultra-processed foods are popping up in dietary guidelines of various countries. And they're being considered for inclusion in the dietary guidelines for Americans. The 2025 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has been meeting to come up with the 2025 dietary guidelines. And for the first time, ultra-processed foods is on their list of topics to consider including, to really look at what the evidence shows. And so specifically, they're doing a literature search on the relationship between consuming dietary patterns with varying amounts of ultra-processed foods and growth, size, body composition, risk of overweight and obesity, and weight loss and maintenance. So this question and Dr. Hall's study really got my lab thinking, what if he had tried to actually match those meals better? Could he have come up with an ultra-processed version of the meals that he provided in his intervention study? And this is where the work from my group comes in. So I'm going to show you two different studies that we've done. One builds an ultra-processed diet that aligns with dietary guidelines recommendations, so a healthy diet made up of mostly ultra-processed foods according to the NOVA system. And then we're going to see more of a standard American diet, an unhealthy diet made up of mostly unprocessed foods. So we'll talk about the healthy ultra-processed foods diet first, and this is a project that I worked on with my graduate advisor, Dr. Slavin, who thank you for the shout out yesterday. And our question was, could we build a sample 2,000 calorie menu for 7 days that aligned with recommendations from the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, their healthy US style eating pattern, so it's kind of a standard and omnivorous eating pattern, that also had 80% or more of its calories coming from ultra-processed foods as they're defined by this NOVA scale. And our aims were to develop a menu of commonly consumed foods. We wanted to use foods that consumers were familiar with, that Americans commonly eat, had a healthy eating index score of greater than or equal to 90. So that's a measure of how closely this diet aligns with the dietary guidelines recommendations. That's 90 out of 100 possible points. We wanted it to have kind of a normal amount of all the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, protein, in line with the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. We wanted it to have adequate amounts of micronutrients and then have 80% or more of the calories coming from these ultra-processed foods. So I have a side-by-side here of just one of the days of eating that we designed for this study. On the left is what we call our DGA NOVA menu. So this is our ultra-processed menu that aligns with recommendations from the dietary guidelines. And on the right is my pyramid menu. So this is kind of an example of how you could follow the dietary guidelines in a day of eating. And you'll see if you compare the breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack meals, the foods chosen are pretty similar between the original dietary guidelines menu and the ultra-processed version of the dietary guidelines menu. The few differences you might see are with the taco salad lunch, the ultra-processed menu has flavored tortilla chips and a pre-made guacamole instead of unflavored tortilla chips and fresh avocado. You'll also see there are a few things that have asterisks next to them on the DGA NOVA side. Those indicate less processed foods that we included just have, for instance, a realistic taco salad is going to have lettuce. There is not an ultra-processed lettuce. So we went ahead and used a group 1 food in our lunch menu. And when we analyzed the total menu, we actually had 91% of the calories coming from ultra-processed foods defined by the NOVA scale. Our menu was adequate in nutrients of concern for Americans, which are calcium, fiber, and potassium. We were a little bit low in a few micronutrients, so vitamin D, vitamin E, and choline. But for those of you who are familiar with micronutrients and trying to get them from foods, it's pretty difficult to get an adequate amount of these specific nutrients from foods anyways. We did have excess sodium. I'll show you that in a few slides. And our final healthy eating index score, so our final diet quality score was 86 out of a possible 100 points. So like I said, we were aiming for a score of 90 or greater in terms of alignment with the dietary guidelines. But when you look side by side at our score of 86 for our ultra-processed dietary guidelines menu and where the average American tends to end up, that 86 starts to look pretty good. So you'll see we had excess sodium in our menu. We didn't have quite enough servings of whole grains. But then if you compare that according to NHANES data, what the average American is consuming, we're largely only meeting recommendations for seafood and plant proteins and total protein foods, and none of the other recommendations from the dietary guidelines. And if you're wondering how this is possible, I know my fellow presenter teed this up nicely with his example of soups. There are several foods that we would largely consider nutrient-dense products that can still be considered ultra-processed. So I have an example of just 3 products here that we either used in our menu or considered using in our menu. And you'll see that the bolded and underlined ingredients is what pushed for the folks who were in charge of determining which NOVA category these foods fit into. This is what pushed it from a group 3 food to a group 4 food. So canned tomato sauce, canned pinto beans, and plain yogurt. And there are several foods that are recommended in US dietary guidelines that can be ultra-processed depending on what the ingredient list is. And this is ultra-processed as it's defined by that NOVA scale. So things like peanut butter, classic American favorite, can be ultra-processed, can be unprocessed. Whole grain bread, if it's store-bought, is an ultra-processed food. Cheddar cheese, if it's an orange cheddar cheese and has a natto added for color, that becomes an ultra-processed foods. There's a lot of discussion about ground meat. There's some interesting letters to the editor about that particular issue. And then if you buy a hard-boiled egg, say you buy a hard-boiled egg at a gas station, it usually has citric acid added. So that also becomes then an ultra-processed food. And if we think about the applications of plant-based diet, so in a sense, all of the dietary patterns that are recommended in the dietary guidelines are plant-based and that they derive most of their calories from plant foods. But if we look more specifically at vegetarian dietary patterns, there's a healthy vegetarian dietary pattern in the dietary guidelines for Americans, and it's an ovo-lacto-vegetarian pattern. So it includes dairy foods and eggs. But we know that not all vegetarians actually eat dairy foods or eggs. And so my lab had actually done some work a few years ago looking at what changes would be required to build an ovo-vegetarian pattern, a lacto-vegetarian pattern, a vegan pattern, or a pesca-vegan pattern from the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. And it's relatively easy to do with a few changes to the protein foods and the dairy foods. But looking at what would have to be substituted in this healthy vegetarian diet to have one of these iterations, an ovo-vegetarian pattern, a lacto-vegetarian pattern, you'd be changing out the dairy foods and the eggs. So the dairy foods are replaced by fortified soy milk and soy yogurt. And like Madeline's presentation alluded to earlier, most of the products that would be substituted for dairy foods are going to be considered ultra-processed. Beans, peas, and lentils, and nuts and seeds, these are probably the two protein food groups that are easiest to find non-ultra-processed versions for, but there are still a number of canned or dried products in these categories, or seed butters and nut butters, that are still considered ultra-processed. And then if you look at soy products, most of the products that are in that category are also going to be considered ultra-processed foods. So if you're looking at a healthy vegetarian dietary pattern that aligns with the dietary guidelines, while we haven't done the analysis, it seems feasible that you could have a diet with most of its calories coming from ultra-processed foods that still meets recommendations for the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern in the dietary guidelines. So moving now into, could we build a Western diet, so more of a typical American diet of low diet quality using mostly unprocessed foods, according to the NOVA scale. And then with this study, we also wanted to explore some of these other motivations to purchase and eat processed food. So we looked at cost differences and we looked at shelf stability differences. And our aim was actually to build a Western diet, so a typical American diet, but we shot a little bit lower in terms of diet quality. So the average American diet quality is around 59, and we went for the first quintile of dietary intake among American adults, and that's an HEI score of about 43. And we also wanted it to have 80% or more calories coming from group 1 and 2 foods in the NOVA scale. So these are your unprocessed foods and your processed culinary ingredients. And I just have a side-by-side picture of one of the example meals. This is the breakfast meal for day 1. And you'll see that these meals look fairly similar. There's toast with butter and jam. There's an egg and cheese dish. And then on the more processed Western menu, because that menu actually had fewer calories, we also added these little potato rounds. And you'll just have to pretend that the water in the cup there is actually juice. One of the things that we haven't published yet from this study is we actually counted the amount of time that it took to prepare the 2 diets, and we used water in place of juice for these studies. So that's why you see water on the pictures here. But one thing that you may not see in the pictures is that all of the bread and the jam on the less processed Western menu are both homemade items. And so these are, of course, only proof of concept studies at this point, and there are all of these other issues, as my fellow presenter mentioned too, in this discourse of ultra-processed foods and dietary patterns. It's not just a question of nutrient density. There's also questions of how do people have access to healthy foods? What kind of time do they have to prepare foods? How much does it cost them to prepare foods? What are health equity issues that come through? And then what about storage time? Is there a benefit to having foods that stay good for longer? And so we actually looked into exploring more quantitative values of a quantitative comparison between these 2 menus, this less processed Western and this more processed Western menu, looking at storage time. And we identified the storage method of each product, whether it was shelf stable, whether it was a frozen product or a refrigerated product. We determined the time to product expiration using resources like this Food Keeper app, which is a USDA resource that shows on average how long each product is stable before going bad and being unsafe. And then we compared the maximum days until expiration for these 2 menus overall. And I haven't yet published these have been submitted to current developments in nutrition, but just to give you a snapshot, The median time to expiration of foods on the less processed versus the more processed menu was 35 days versus 120 days. We really saw a significant difference in shelf stability between these menus, which could have implications for folks who have limited time to grocery shop or limited opportunities to grocery shop. And finally, I want to talk about, I get a question often when I present this work, why did you create menus instead of looking at dietary patterns? And we actually got this from a peer reviewer in our paper too. Why did you create these menus? Why didn't you look at dietary patterns? When we talk about dietary patterns and look at patterns recommended in the dietary guidelines, you see things like 2 cups of fruit are recommended and 5 to 7 servings of vegetables are recommended. But you can't do that with applying the NOVA scale because you have to get to the granular level of the individual food products and the individual food brands that create those products. And I like to use this example of garbanzo beans or chickpeas, where a garbanzo bean is not a garbanzo bean when you're applying the NOVA scale. So we have these 2 different cans here. One is a category 3 processed food, and then the one on the right is an ultra processed food because it has disodium EDTA to promote color retention, which is then considered a cosmetic additive and pushes that can into ultra processed category. But there's implications beyond just how processed is it, mostly with the cost. And I don't have an analysis of this overall. This is just an example, but you see that the cost of the less processed can is almost double the cost of the more processed can. When we're thinking about getting people to eat more pulse foods, does it matter whether they choose can 1 or can 2 if they're choosing to eat beans at all? And so I'll conclude that diets of low quality can be comprised mostly of less processed foods according to NOVA, just like high quality diets can be comprised mostly of ultra processed foods according to NOVA. Decreasing ultra processed food intake is not a guarantee of a more nutritious diet. And our more processed Western menu was similarly nutrient poor to our less processed Western menu, but at a longer shelf stability. And with that, I'll say a huge thank you to my team and to all of my collaborators, and thank you for your attention.